Sign this confession right now. I'll throw you enough spare change to buy a cheap coffin. Do you honestly think a judge is going to believe a billionaire who creates thousands of jobs? Or a black janitor who spends his days scrubbing toilets in the slums? Take the fall, you piece of trash. Sharp, crisp $100 bills were crumpled up and thrown violently directly into Marcus's weathered face. They fluttered down onto the expensive, deep red velvet carpet in the penthouse office of the Vance Chemical Corporation. The atmosphere was so suffocatingly tense that you could hear the desperate, ragged breathing of the broken man. Marcus, a small, soft-spoken black security guard and widowed father, was kneeling on one knee on the floor. His rough, calloused hands were shaking uncontrollably. His eyes were bloodshot, filled with the absolute, crushing despair of a father being pushed to the very edge of a cliff. Towering over him was Richard Vance, the arrogant, ruthless chairman of the conglomerate, wearing a custom-tailored suit worth tens of thousands of dollars. Thick smoke from a premium imported cigar drifted from his sneering lips, mingling with the sickening stench of extreme wealth and unchecked power. He looked down at Marcus with the cold, dead eyes of a superior being observing a worthless insect. In a dark corner of the lavish office, David Miller, the chief operating officer and Richard's right-hand man, stood frozen. He kept his head bowed, desperately avoiding Marcus's pleading gaze. David's fists were clenched so tightly that his knuckles were stark white, his fingernails digging painfully into his own palms. He was the one man who knew every dirty, disgusting secret behind that forged confession paper on the desk. But his cowardice and greed had locked his jaw shut. The high-pitched, mocking laughter of Dr. Eris Thorne, the head of research, shattered the heavy silence. He casually poured himself a glass of vintage champagne, swirling the golden liquid before taking a highly satisfied sip. They were celebrating because they had found the perfect, helpless scapegoat to cover up a monumental crime. A crime that was silently killing hundreds of innocent people in this very county. But hold on a second. How did a dedicated, honest security guard fall into this deadly, inescapable trap? How did a multi-billion-dollar empire decide to systematically destroy the life of a poor, single father? To understand the root of this ruthless oppression, we have to rewind the clock. We need to go back exactly 6 months. Back to the day when the crystal-clear creek behind the dilapidated trailer park started bleeding a sickening purple. The urban slum was nestled deep within the suffocating shadow of the massive Vance chemical plant. Giant smokestacks relentlessly vomited thick, black plumes of toxic smoke into the sky, day and night. This was the only refuge for those living at the absolute bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. A place where poverty clung to people like an incurable, rotting disease. And this was the only home Marcus and his daughter could afford. Marcus worked the grueling graveyard shift at the plant. Every single day, he faced the condescending glares and venomous insults from the wealthy upper management. He was treated like disposable garbage, ordered around to do the most degrading tasks imaginable in the hazardous waste zones. But he swallowed his pride and endured the humiliation in total silence. Because waiting for him at home was Lily. His 10-year-old daughter was the only light left in his dark world after his wife passed away. Lily was not like the other kids in the rough, concrete neighborhood. She didn't care for cheap plastic toys or playing in the dangerous alleys filled with broken glass. Her entire world revolved around nature. She loved the wild, overgrown weeds by the creek and the tiny silver fish darting through the cool water. More than anything, she had an intense, almost obsessive passion for drawing maps. Lily would scavenge for scraps of paper, old calendars, and discarded cardboard boxes from the dumpsters to bind into a makeshift notebook. Using tiny, worn-out colored pencils her father found in the trash, she meticulously mapped out every curve of the stream, She documented every bird's nest and every large mossy rock along the muddy bank. It was a late October afternoon. The sky was stained a bruised, ominous red by the setting sun. Lily clutched her battered notebook, her bare feet stepping softly on the familiar grassy bank. But today something felt horribly, violently wrong. The air no longer smelled of damp earth and crisp autumn leaves. Instead, a pungent, sour chemical stench punched her in the lungs, making her cough violently. She wiped her watering eyes and looked down at the water. Her large, dark eyes widened in absolute, paralyzing horror. The clear stream where she soaked her feet every day had transformed into a murky, toxic blackish-purple sludge. Thick, greasy foam bubbled ominously on the surface, releasing a hissing sound. The tiny silver fish were no longer darting through the currents. They were floating belly up, a blanket of dead white scales washing up against the mud. Life was literally being choked out of the water. A chilling premonition settled into the little girl's innocent mind. She crouched down, pulled out a clean glass strawberry jam jar, and carefully scooped up a sample of the grotesque black liquid. The unnatural purple hue reflected the dying light of the sunset. Right at that moment, the heavy, intimidating thud of combat boots echoed behind her. It was Officer Thomas, a local patrol cop with deep, exhausted wrinkles etched into his face from years on the force. Mounted squarely on his chest was a standard-issue police body camera, its small red light blinking steadily, recording every frame in raw, unforgiving high definition. He was conducting a routine perimeter check of the industrial zone when he spotted a small figure trespassing in the restricted sector. "Hey kid, what are you doing out here? This area is restricted and highly dangerous." His booming voice startled Lily, causing her to drop the glass jar onto the grass. Officer Thomas stepped forward, intending to grab her arm and pull her away from the hazardous mud. But as his eyes tracked downward and met the bubbling blackish-purple sludge of the creek, his boots froze in the dirt. His chest-mounted body cam captured the entire grotesque landscape in perfect, unedited clarity. The raw footage documented the exact shade of the unnatural water, the piles of dead wildlife, and the terrified face of the small, impoverished black girl desperately trying to retrieve her jar of toxic evidence. Officer Thomas frowned deeply, a heavy knot tightening in his stomach. He instinctively reached for his shoulder radio to report a severe environmental hazard, but his hand hesitated. He knew exactly how much corrupt power the Vance Corporation wielded over the local police department and the town's politicians. He knew a simple radio call could cost him his pension, his career, or worse. With a heavy, defeated sigh, he slowly pulled his hand away from the radio and gently placed it on Lily's trembling shoulder. "Go home, little girl. This place isn't safe for you anymore." He had no idea that this fleeting, seemingly insignificant encounter was the beginning of the end. He had no idea that the raw, unedited footage sitting silently on his bodycam's memory card would soon become the ultimate weapon. A piece of undeniable digital evidence that, when combined with the 10-year-old girl's hand-drawn map, would utterly destroy a billionaire's arrogant empire. Lily hurried back to the cramped, moldy trailer they called home. She carefully tucked the glass jar containing the deadly purple liquid deep underneath her small cot, hiding it behind a pile of old shoeboxes. Her little hands, stained with mud and whatever chemical was destroying her playground, frantically grabbed her colored pencils. She began to furiously update her map. She used her darkest, ugliest purple crayon to color in the exact spot where the water had died. She didn't know the scientific names for the heavy metals or the carcinogenic compounds eating away at the soil, but she knew exactly where the poison was coming from. The massive, rust-covered drainage pipe jutting out from the concrete wall of the Vance chemical plant. While a 10-year-old girl was connecting the dots in a dimly lit trailer, a much more sinister conversation was unfolding in the pristine, temperature-controlled laboratory on the top floor of that very plant. David Miller, the chief operating officer, stared at the glowing tablet in his hands. A bead of cold sweat rolled down the side of his impeccably groomed face. The numbers on the screen were not just bad. They were absolutely catastrophic. Dear. Eris Thorne, the lead chemical engineer, stood across from him, wiping his spectacles with a silk microfiber cloth, looking entirely unbothered. Toxicity levels in the groundwater runoff are exceeding 500% of the maximum legal threshold. David read aloud, his voice trembling slightly. Eris, this isn't just a minor violation. This is industrial manslaughter. Dr. Thorne merely chuckled, a dry, reedy sound that lacked any trace of human empathy. Oh, come on, David, let's not be melodramatic. It's just a little concentrated byproduct from the new synthetic resin line. The local wildlife might develop a third eye, but our profit margins are up 32% this quarter. Before David could argue, the heavy oak doors of the laboratory swung open. Richard Vance strolled in, smelling of expensive scotch and unchecked arrogance. He snatched the tablet from David's hands, glanced at the glowing red graphs for barely 2 seconds, and tossed it carelessly onto a stainless steel counter. Fix the numbers, Eris, Richard commanded smoothly. I don't care how you do it. Just recalibrate the sensors to show a safe readout. David stepped forward, his moral compass struggling to surface. Richard, we can't just hide this. The filtration system is completely shot, and the overflow is dumping directly into the creek behind the residential zone. There are families living right below the property line. Richard slowly turned to face David, his cold blue eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. He stepped into David's personal space, jabbing a manicured finger hard into David's chest. Those aren't families, David. Those are leeches living in subsidized housing, waiting for a government handout. My grandfather built this town, and this factory pays for the schools their miserable children attend. If a few of them get a rash, they should consider it the price of living in the shadow of greatness. David opened his mouth to speak, but the words died in his throat. You like your 6-figure salary, don't you, David? Richard whispered venomously. You like your wife's luxury SUV and your daughter's private school tuition? Then you will close your mouth, look the other way, and let me run my company. Because if this leaks, I promise you, I will ruin you before the authorities even open an investigation. David swallowed hard, the taste of bile rising in the back of his throat. He nodded slowly, selling his soul for the comfort of his corner office. He had no idea that his cowardly silence was about to put Marcus directly in the crosshairs of a deadly conspiracy. Later that same night, a heavy, unseasonal rainstorm lashed against the corrugated metal roofs of the factory. Marcus was working a double shift, his worn-out boots sloshing through the oily puddles in Sector 4. Sector 4 was the oldest, most dilapidated part of the compound. It was a graveyard of rusted storage tanks and decommissioned pipelines that the company claimed were entirely empty. But as Marcus patrolled the dark, echoing corridor with his flickering flashlight, a sharp, chemical odor burned his nostrils. It was the exact same sickeningly sweet, sour smell that his daughter had inhaled by the creek earlier that afternoon. Marcus tightened his grip on his heavy flashlight and followed the scent. Deep in the bowels of the facility, tucked away behind a chain-link fence that had been illegally cut open, he found it. Dozens of unlabeled, corroding steel barrels were stacked haphazardly in the mud. Thick, blackish-purple sludge was steadily leaking from the rusted seams, pooling on the concrete floor, and draining directly into an open, unfiltered storm grate. The same grate that led straight down to the creek in the slums. Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs. He knew he wasn't supposed to be here, but his conscience wouldn't let him turn away. He pulled out his cheap, cracked smartphone and snapped 3 blurry photographs of the leaking barrels and the open drain. Knowing the danger, he immediately marched up to the administrative wing, his boots leaving muddy tracks on the polished linoleum. He knocked on the glass door of Dr. Eris Thorne's office, hoping to report a critical hazard before someone got seriously hurt. Dr. Thorne looked up from his computer, his face twisting into a mask of pure disgust at the sight of the soaked, dirty black security guard standing in his doorway. "What do you want?" Thorne snapped, not even bothering to offer Marcus a seat. "Sir, there's a massive leak down in Sector 4, Marcus said, out of breath. Someone dumped unmarked barrels near the old storm drain, and it's spilling toxic waste straight into the public waterway. We need to shut down the main valve immediately." Dr. Thorne leaned back in his plush leather chair, a cruel, condescending smile spreading across his face. He interlaced his fingers and looked at Marcus as if he were an amusing, talking monkey. "Tell me, Marcus, did you get your degree in chemical engineering from a cereal box? Or did you pick it up in a prison yard?" Marcus stiffened, the racial undertone of the insult hitting him like a physical blow. "I don't need a degree to know that purple sludge burning my eyes is dangerous, sir. I have photos. Dear." Thorne stood up abruptly, his chair rolling back with a loud screech. "You listen to me, you uneducated nobody. Your job is to walk in circles and make sure teenagers don't graffiti the walls. You do not analyze our chemical byproducts, and you certainly do not tell me how to do my job. If you ever wander into a restricted zone again, or if you ever mention this imaginary leak to anyone, I will have you fired, blacklisted, and thrown in jail for industrial espionage. Now get out of my office and go scrub a toilet." Marcus stood frozen, his fists clenched tightly at his sides, swallowing the bitter pill of humiliation to protect the meager paycheck that kept his daughter alive. He slowly backed out of the room, completely unaware that by revealing his discovery, he had just painted a massive target on his own back. Marcus slowly backed out of the pristine laboratory, his fists trembling at his sides. He swallowed the bitter, jagged pill of humiliation, choosing his daughter's survival over his own fractured pride. He had no idea that by opening his mouth, he had just handed them the perfect weapon to destroy him. Less than 48 hours later, all hell broke loose in the executive boardroom of the Vance Chemical Corporation. It was 3 in the morning. Outside, a violent, unseasonal thunderstorm was raging, hurling sheets of freezing rain against the floor-to-ceiling panoramic windows. Inside, the atmosphere was even more volatile. Richard Vance hurled a heavy crystal whiskey decanter across the room. It shattered against the mahogany wall, sending shards of expensive glass and amber liquid raining down onto the plush carpet. "An unannounced, full-scale federal audit," Richard screamed, his face flushed purple with absolute, uncontrollable rage. "The Environmental Protection Agency is sending a tactical inspection team here by tomorrow morning. Which one of you incompetent morons let the toxicity reports leak to the regional office?" David Miller, the chief operating officer, sat paralyzed in his leather chair, the color completely draining from his face. He knew a federal audit meant prison time for all of them. Dr. Eris Thorne, however, remained unervingly calm. He slowly wiped a speck of dust off his tailored lapel and stepped forward into the dim, moody lighting of the boardroom. "We don't have a leak in the department, Richard." Dr. Thorne's voice was silky, venomous, and dripping with malicious intent. "We have a minor spill in Sector 4, and I believe I have already found our culprit." Richard stopped pacing, his icy blue eyes locking onto the head researcher. "Explain, dear." Thorne smiled, a thin, cruel stretching of his lips. 2 nights ago, one of our graveyard shift security guards was snooping around the decommissioned tanks. A black man, poorly educated, living in the slums with a sick kid. He came to my office rambling about leaking barrels. He's desperate, Richard. And desperate men do stupid, reckless things for money. The silence in the boardroom grew thick, suffocating, and incredibly dangerous. David's heart began to hammer violently against his ribs. He knew exactly who Thorne was talking about. Marcus, the quiet, hard-working father who always showed up early and never complained. "What are you proposing, heiress?" Richard asked, his voice dropping to a low, predatory whisper. "It's a very simple, elegant narrative, sir," Thorne replied smoothly. This guard discovered the chemical storage. He thought he could siphon off some of the raw synthetic precursors to sell on the black market to local drug manufacturers. But because he's an uneducated idiot, he botched the extraction. He broke the valve, caused the toxic spill, and jeopardized this entire facility. Richard's eyes widened slightly, the sheer brilliance of the evil plan washing over him. He let out a sharp, dark bark of laughter. "It's perfect. The media loves a story about a greedy, ghetto criminal sabotaging a pillar of the community. But what about the remaining sludge in Sector 4? The EPA will find it." Thorne waved his hand dismissively. "We flush it. Tonight, under the cover of this massive storm, we pump the rest of the highly toxic residue directly into the old, forgotten underground drainage pipes. The rain will wash it straight into the slum's creek by morning, diluting the evidence before the feds even arrive. But we need the guard to be at the exact right place at the exact right time." Richard turned his gaze slowly toward David. David, who was sweating profusely, his hands trembling underneath the heavy mahogany table. "You're the head of operations, David." Richard's voice was cold, authoritative, and left absolutely zero room for refusal. "Change his patrol schedule. Put him right next to the main overflow valve in Sector 4 at exactly 4 a.m. Make sure the security cameras catch him standing there right when the system purges." David opened his mouth, his throat bone dry. "Richard, he has a little girl. If we frame him for a federal environmental crime, he's going to prison for decades. His daughter will go to a state orphanage." Richard leaned over the table, placing both hands flat on the polished wood, bringing his face inches from David's sweating forehead. "I do not care if she goes to an orphanage or a dog pound. You will do exactly as you are told, or I will personally make sure you share a cell with him. Do you understand me?" David swallowed a heavy lump of pure guilt. He thought about his massive mortgage, his country club membership, and his comfortable, insulated life. He slowly nodded his head, selling the last remaining shred of his humanity. "Yes, sir." An hour later, David walked down into the cold, dimly lit concrete basement that served as the employee break room. The air smelled of cheap bleach and old coffee. Sitting alone in the corner at a chipped plastic table was Marcus. The exhausted father was eating a stale, cold cheese sandwich wrapped in a cheap paper towel. Next to his meager meal was a small framed photograph of Lily, smiling brightly in a field of wild dandelions. Marcus was staring at the photo, his tired eyes filled with a deep, unconditional love that transcended all of his physical pain. David stood in the doorway, the forged patrol schedule burning a hole in his sweaty hand. A fierce battle raged inside his chest. All he had to do was tell this man to run. All he had to do was walk away, call the FBI, and end this nightmare. But cowardice is a heavy, paralyzing anchor. David forced his face into a mask of corporate indifference and stepped into the room. "Marcus, there's been a change in protocol tonight." Marcus immediately stood up, respectfully wiping crumbs from his faded uniform. "Yes, Mr. Miller? I need you to run a continuous perimeter check on the old drainage valves in Sector 4 for the rest of your shift. Don't leave that spot until you're relieved at dawn." Marcus looked slightly confused, remembering the toxic leak he had reported, but he didn't dare question a direct order from the chief operating officer. "Understood, sir. I'll head down there right now." As Marcus picked up his heavy flashlight and walked past him out into the freezing torrential rain, David closed his eyes. He had just sent an innocent, hard-working father directly into a federal slaughterhouse. The freezing rain continued to batter the rusted metal roofs of the Vance chemical plant. Every single drop felt like a sharp, icy needle against Marcus's skin as he trudged heavily towards Sector 4. He clicked on his heavy standard-issue flashlight. The weak, flickering yellow beam struggled desperately to cut through the torrential, blinding downpour. He didn't know that the massive, hidden underground pumps were already humming to life beneath his soaking wet boots. He didn't know that millions of gallons of highly toxic, unregulated synthetic waste were currently being routed directly toward his assigned position. Meanwhile, less than a mile away, in a cold, drafty, leaking trailer, a 10-year-old girl abruptly woke up. Lily coughed violently, her small, fragile chest heaving as the damp, moldy air aggravated her rapidly deteriorating lungs. She reached out in the darkness for the plastic cup of water on her nightstand, but her small hand brushed against her precious, battered notebook. The hand-drawn, meticulously detailed map of the dying creek. A sudden terrifying thought struck her innocent but razor-sharp mind. The storm, the massive unprecedented amount of rushing rainwater would inevitably wash away the thick, bubbling purple sludge. It would completely erase the physical evidence of whatever poison was killing the silver fish and burning her throat every single day. She had to get one final, undeniable sample directly from the main drainage pipe before it was too late. Lily quietly slipped out of her warm, patched quilt. She put on a pair of oversized, scuffed yellow rain boots and a thin, cheap plastic yellow raincoat that offered absolutely zero protection against the bitter, bone-chilling cold. She grabbed her last clean strawberry jam jar and a heavy metal soup spoon from the tiny kitchen counter. Without waking the elderly, half-deaf neighbor who usually checked on her when Marcus worked the late shift, Lily pushed open the squeaky aluminum trailer door. She stepped bravely out into the raging, unforgiving storm. The journey from the forgotten slum to the heavily guarded edge of the industrial zone was an absolute nightmare for a sick, exhausted child. The familiar dirt paths had turned into treacherous, fast-moving rivers of thick, slippery, hazardous mud. The freezing wind howled through the narrow, trash-filled alleys, threatening to blow her tiny, undernourished frame completely over into the sharp gravel. But Lily tightened her freezing grip on the cold glass jar and pushed forward with incredible determination. She was driven by a pure, uncorrupted sense of justice that the greedy billionaires in their climate-controlled penthouses could never possibly comprehend. She finally reached the towering, rusted chain-link fence topped with menacing coils of barbed wire that separated the residential zone from the massive chemical plant. She knew exactly where a large, jagged hole had been illegally cut near the main storm drain outfall. She squeezed her small, trembling body through the sharp metal wire. A rusty barb snagged her raincoat and deeply scraped her knee, drawing warm blood, but she didn't dare cry out. She scrambled dangerously down the steep, slippery, weed-choked embankment toward the massive concrete drainage pipe. The smell down here was absolutely, overwhelmingly unbearable. It was a concentrated, suffocating, putrid odor of burning sulfur, rotting eggs, and harsh industrial bleach. Lily quickly tied a small, dirty rag around her lower face to try and stop the violent, agonizing coughing fits. She crept closer to the edge of the rushing, contaminated water. High above her on the elevated, highly restricted private access road, a massive luxury black SUV slowly rolled to a stop in the pouring rain. Inside the heated, soundproof, leather-lined cabin sat David Miller. He was conducting a final visual sweep of the plant's perimeter to ensure there were absolutely no unexpected witnesses to the illegal, catastrophic purge. The heavy, expensive windshield wipers violently slapped the freezing rain away in a hypnotic rhythm. David squinted through the darkness, his high-beam LED headlights sweeping across the muddy, flooded embankment below. Suddenly, the intensely bright lights caught a tiny flash of bright, unnatural yellow. David instantly slammed his foot on the brake pedal, his heart leaping violently into his throat. He quickly rolled down his heavily tinted window, instantly letting the freezing rain and the sickening toxic stench blast into his pristine, expensive vehicle. He frantically grabbed a pair of high-powered, military-grade binoculars from the passenger seat and pressed them hard against his eyes. Through the magnified night vision lenses he saw her clearly, a little black girl in a cheap, torn plastic raincoat, kneeling dangerously close to the hazardous mud. She was meticulously scooping thick, bubbling, highly corrosive purple sludge into a small, fragile glass jam jar. David's breath violently hitched in his chest. He instantly recognized the little girl from the framed, worn-out photograph sitting on Marcus's table in the depressing basement break room. It was Lily. He watched in absolute horror as the little girl was suddenly gripped by a brutal, agonizing coughing fit. She dropped the heavy spoon and clutched her small chest in severe pain, her tiny body racking with violent spasms. She was standing directly in the invisible, deadly path of the concentrated chemical vapor cloud rising from the pipe. A sickening, overwhelming wave of pure, unfiltered guilt crashed over David's conscience. He had an 8-year-old daughter at home, sleeping safely and soundly under a luxurious down comforter in a gated community. What if that was his little girl down there in the mud, breathing in deadly, irreversible carcinogens? His trembling hand hovered desperately over the chrome door handle. He could get out of the car right now. He could run down that slippery, dangerous hill, scoop that sick, vulnerable child into his arms, and drive her straight to the best hospital in the state. He could pick up his phone, call the federal authorities, and end this entire, evil corporate empire tonight. He could finally be a good man. But then, his encrypted corporate cell phone buzzed aggressively in the glowing cup holder. The caller ID flashed a single terrifying name: Richard Vance, the ruthless billionaire who owned his career, his 6-figure salary, his reputation, and his freedom. David stared at the violently vibrating phone, his moral compass spinning completely, hopelessly out of control. He looked back down at the freezing, coughing, dying child in the toxic mud. Then he looked at the ringing phone again. Slowly, cowardly, and with a sickening feeling of self-hatred, David rolled up the tinted window. He purposefully sealed himself back inside his insulated, soundproof bubble of extreme wealth and disgusting complicity. He put the heavy SUV into drive and pressed the gas pedal, accelerating rapidly away into the stormy, pitch-black night. He left a 10-year-old girl to drown in the toxic waste he was highly paid to hide. Down below the embankment, completely oblivious to the cowardly man who had just condemned her and her father to death, Lily secured the metal lid tightly onto her jam jar. She stuffed the dangerous, radioactive-looking evidence deep into the torn pocket of her yellow raincoat, clutching it fiercely against her side like a priceless, glowing treasure. She scrambled desperately back up the slippery, muddy bank and disappeared into the shadows of the slum. She was completely unaware of the massive, life-altering catastrophe about to unfold on the other side of the razor wire fence. Deep inside the decaying bowels of Sector 4, Marcus was standing exactly where he was ordered to be. He was positioned right next to the massive, heavily rusted main pressure valve of the decommissioned chemical holding tanks. The glowing red digital clock on the cracked concrete wall blinked exactly 4 a.m. Suddenly, a deafening, terrifying metallic screech echoed violently through the cavernous, empty sector. The solid concrete ground beneath his wet boots began to vibrate violently, like a localized earthquake. A high-pressure, blaring alarm siren began wailing uncontrollably, casting a frantic, spinning, blood-red light across the damp walls. Marcus spun around in sheer panic, aiming his weak flashlight directly at the giant, glass-faced pressure gauge. The black needle was instantly redlining past the maximum danger zone. Before his brain could even process the danger, before he could even reach for his shoulder radio to scream for help, the massive rusted steel valve violently blew off its reinforced hinges. A deafening, earth-shattering explosion of highly pressurized, boiling blackish-purple chemical sludge erupted high into the air like a deadly, toxic geyser. The sheer, catastrophic physical force of the sudden blast knocked Marcus completely off his feet. He was thrown violently backward, slamming hard onto the unforgiving concrete floor. He desperately scrambled backward on his hands and knees, violently coughing and choking as the deadly, burning liquid instantly flooded the floor of the facility. The thick acidic chemical cloud instantly burned his eyes, blinding him, and seared the delicate lining of his lungs with every desperate breath. Through the blinding, agonizing, toxic mist, Marcus looked up toward the high ceiling. Mounted directly above the ruptured, spewing valve, staring blindly and coldly through the terrifying chaos, was a high-definition corporate security camera. A bright, steady red light blinked ominously on its plastic casing. It was recording absolutely everything. It was recording a desperate, low-wage, uneducated black security guard standing exactly at ground zero of a catastrophic million-dollar environmental disaster. The billionaire's trap had officially, brutally snapped shut, and Marcus was completely, hopelessly caught inside it, bleeding and choking in the dark. The deafening wail of emergency sirens violently shattered the remaining silence of the stormy night. Harsh, flashing red and blue strobe lights sliced through the thick, toxic fog hanging over Sector 4. Tactical response units quickly established a hard perimeter, their heavy cruisers aggressively blocking all potential exit routes from the Vance chemical plant. Convoys of heavily armored federal vehicles and local hazardous materials teams aggressively breached the main gates. Men and women completely encased in thick, bright yellow Level A hazmat suits swarmed the catastrophic spill zone to initiate containment protocols. Deep inside the ruined, flooded concrete bunker, 2 federal agents dragged a semi-conscious, violently coughing figure out of the boiling purple sludge. It was Marcus. His cheap, faded security uniform was completely eaten away by the highly corrosive synthetic acids. His skin was heavily blistered, raw, and burning with an unimaginable searing agony. Every single desperate gasp for air felt like inhaling crushed glass and hot battery acid. But the physical torture was absolutely nothing compared to the psychological nightmare that was about to unfold. Standing safely behind the yellow police tape, completely untouched by the toxic mud, was Dr. Eris Thorne. He was wearing a pristine, custom-tailored trench coat, holding a sleek, waterproof digital tablet. He looked incredibly calm, practiced, and maliciously prepared to execute their narrative. Dr. Thorne handed the glowing tablet directly to the lead tactical commander of the Environmental Protection Agency. The commander, a stern man with tactical gear over his hazmat suit, watched the high-definition security footage playing on the screen. It was the perfectly framed, masterfully manipulated video from the camera mounted directly above the ruptured pressure valve. The footage clearly showed Marcus standing right next to the massive control wheel at the exact moment of the catastrophic failure. Without the audio context, without knowing Marcus was specifically ordered to be there, it looked exactly like deliberate malicious sabotage. "I caught him snooping around the decommissioned tanks 2 days ago," Dr. Thorne lied smoothly, his voice dripping with perfectly fake disappointment. "We believe he was trying to illegally siphon off concentrated synthetic resin precursors to sell to local drug cartels in the slums. He didn't know what he was doing, and his absolute uneducated greed just caused $1 million environmental disaster." The lead investigator's face hardened with pure, unadulterated disgust. He aggressively signaled to 2 heavily armed local police officers holding the perimeter. Take him into custody immediately. The officers didn't care that Marcus was severely injured, bleeding, and barely able to stand on his own 2 feet. They moved in swiftly, executing a harsh compliance control hold, violently twisting his blistered arms tightly behind his back. They slammed him face-first against the side of a tactical vehicle and forced the heavy steel handcuffs down onto his wrists. The sharp metallic click of the locking mechanism echoed through the rain like a definitive death sentence. "No, please, you don't understand," Marcus rasped, violently coughing up a frightening mixture of blood and black soot. "I was ordered to be there. I was just doing my patrol job." "Shut your mouth and stop resisting, you piece of trash," one of the arresting officers snarled, forcefully shoving Marcus forward toward a waiting transport cruiser. At that exact moment, a massive, heavily armored black Bentley glided smoothly into the chaotic, flashing courtyard. A personal assistant rushed out, quickly opening a massive black umbrella to shield the VIP passenger from a single drop of rain. Richard Vance stepped out of the luxury vehicle. He was dressed in a dark, incredibly expensive 3-piece suit, looking like an untouchable king descending to inspect his ruined kingdom. Local news vans had already breached the outer perimeter, their bright, blinding camera lights focusing intensely on the billionaire CEO. Richard immediately put on a masterful, Oscar-worthy theatrical performance for the press. He didn't look angry, he looked deeply, profoundly betrayed by someone he trusted. He walked slowly toward the police cruiser where Marcus was currently being pinned against the wet hood by the officers. Richard stopped just a few feet away, making sure the news cameras captured his perfect, sorrowful profile perfectly. "This is the ultimate, heartbreaking tragedy of the lower class," Richard announced loudly, his booming voice cutting effortlessly through the storm and the sirens. "We build state-of-the-art factories to pull these people out of the filthy gutters. We give them honest paychecks, we put food on their cheap tables, and we offer them a chance at a civilized, decent life. And how do they repay our generosity? With theft, with malicious sabotage, with absolute primitive greed." He pointed a manicured, perfectly clean finger directly at Marcus's bleeding, swollen face. "This uneducated animal tried to rob my company to feed his pathetic, criminal lifestyle. Because of him, this entire county is now at severe risk of contamination." Marcus shook his head frantically, warm tears mixing with the freezing rain and the toxic chemicals burning his cheeks. "That's a lie. He's lying to all of you. I reported the leak to management. I tried to stop it. Nobody listened to a desperate, poor black man covered in toxic waste and heavy steel handcuffs." The reporters furiously scribbled down Richard's quotes, completely buying into the false narrative of the generous billionaire victimized by the greedy street thug. Through the blinding camera flashes and the pouring rain, Marcus desperately scanned the crowd of terrified, whispering factory workers. He was looking for his only potential savior. He saw him, standing near the edge of the police barricade, hiding cowardly underneath a large black umbrella, was David Miller, the chief operating officer, the man who had personally handed him the forged patrol schedule just hours ago, the man who knew the absolute, undeniable truth about the illegal purge. Marcus's desperate, pleading eyes locked directly onto David's pale, heavily sweating face. "Tell them, Mr. Miller," Marcus screamed, his voice breaking with unbearable agony and sheer terror. "Tell them you ordered me down there to the valve. Please, I have a sick little girl at home. She has absolutely nobody else in the world. Please just tell them the truth." The entire courtyard went momentarily silent, waiting for the wealthy, respected executive to respond to the wild accusations. David physically flinched at the sudden mention of the little girl. The horrific, haunting image of Lily coughing in the toxic mud flashed violently in his cowardly mind. His conscience screamed at him to step forward to grab a microphone to tell the tactical officers to arrest Richard Vance right now. But as David opened his mouth, he felt a cold, terrifying gaze burning into the side of his head. He slowly turned and saw Richard Vance staring directly at him. Richard wasn't smiling, but his cold, dead eyes promised absolute, merciless destruction if David dared to speak a single word of truth. David's throat went completely, painfully dry. The heavy weight of his massive mortgage, his luxury cars, and his elite, insulated status crushed the last remaining ounce of his courage. He looked back at Marcus, the desperate, broken father begging for his life. David slowly, cowardly, shook his head in denial. "I have absolutely no idea what this deranged man is talking about," David lied, his voice barely a whisper, but loud enough for the police to hear and seal Marcus's fate. He was strictly assigned to guard the front gate tonight. He went down to Sector 4 on his own malicious accord. The final devastating nail was brutally hammered into the coffin. Marcus let out a guttural, soul-crushing scream of pure, absolute despair as the police officers violently shoved him into the back of the reinforced cruiser. The heavy metal door slammed shut, completely cutting off his agonizing cries for justice. The elite trap was absolutely perfect. The untouchable billionaires had won, and a poor innocent father was being hauled away to face decades in federal prison, leaving a sick 10-year-old girl completely alone in a dying, poisoned slum. The heavy reinforced steel door of the police cruiser slammed shut, trapping Marcus in a cold, unforgiving darkness. That was precisely 6 months ago. 6 agonizing, brutal months of being ground into dust by a corrupt, rigged justice system, designed to protect the rich and punish the poor. Now the timeline forcefully snaps back to the present moment. Back to the suffocating, luxurious penthouse office of the Vance Chemical Corporation. Back to the exact moment where our story began. Your skin is already filthy, so what does it matter if it absorbs a little of my toxic waste? Richard Vance's cruel, venomous words echoed against the expensive mahogany walls. He threw the crumpled, crisp $100 bills directly into Marcus's exhausted, beaten face. Marcus was kneeling on the imported red velvet carpet, his spirit completely, utterly shattered. The horrific events of that stormy night had absolutely destroyed his life. He was currently out on a massive predatory bail bond that he could never possibly repay in 10 lifetimes. And the arrogant billionaire CEO standing over him was offering him a disgusting, twisted, inescapable deal. Take the full blame, plead guilty to all federal charges of massive industrial sabotage, and quietly disappear into a maximum security prison for the rest of his natural life. In exchange, Richard Vance would graciously drop the multi-million-dollar corporate civil lawsuit against Marcus. But that wasn't the real leverage. The real sickening leverage was lying in a sterile white hospital bed across town. Lily, his beautiful, brilliant 10-year-old daughter. The concentrated, unfiltered exposure to the toxic vapor cloud that night had aggressively and mercilessly ravaged her small, fragile lungs. She was currently hooked up to loud, terrifying respiratory machines, her tiny chest violently heaving with every single breath. She was coughing up dark, frightening blood every single hour. The medical bills were astronomical, completely out of reach for a suspended, disgraced, and bankrupt security guard. "Sign the damn confession paper, Marcus," Richard hissed, leaning in so incredibly close that Marcus could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. "If you dare to fight my legal team in court, I will personally ensure your pathetic bank accounts are permanently frozen by tomorrow morning. The hospital administration will legally kick that dying, wheezing brat out onto the cold, unforgiving pavement before noon. The doctors say she has maybe 3 weeks before the synthetic resin completely crystallizes in her pulmonary tracts. She will suffocate to death in the gutter, and it will be entirely your fault." Marcus closed his bloodshot, exhausted eyes, a hot, agonizing tear rolling down his scarred cheek. He remembered the exact day Lily was born, how he held her tiny hand and promised to protect her from this cruel, unfair world. He had failed her completely. He was just a poor, uneducated black man fighting a ruthless billionaire who practically owned the entire state's judicial system. His trembling, calloused, blistered hand reached out slowly. He picked up the heavy, solid gold fountain pen from the polished mahogany desk. He looked down at the flawlessly typed confession. It was a legal document filled with absolute, malicious, meticulously crafted lies written by Dr. Eris Thorne. With a broken, defeated, soul-crushing sob, Marcus pressed the expensive pen to the thick paper. He signed his own life away to buy his little girl a few more months of medical care. A heavy drop of his salty, bitter tears fell onto the document, blurring the blue ink of his forced signature. Richard Vance immediately snatched the paper off the desk, a triumphant, genuinely demonic smile stretching widely across his face. "Good boy," Richard mocked, patting Marcus roughly on the shoulder like a trained, obedient dog. "See, Dr. Thorne? I told you these lower-class animals eventually learn how to obey their absolute betters." Dr. Thorne laughed loudly, a sharp, grating sound that filled the room. He raised his crystal glass of vintage champagne to toast their complete, undeniable, sickening victory. They had successfully murdered a vital river ecosystem, poisoned a marginalized community, and pinned the entire atrocity on a helpless, loving father. But they had completely forgotten about the fourth man standing in the room. David Miller, the chief operating officer, was still standing silently in the dark corner. He watched Marcus slowly stand up, looking like a completely dead, empty, walking shell of a human being. David's wide eyes locked onto the smudged tear stain on the white confession paper. In that exact, singular, defining fraction of a second, something inside David's insulated, cowardly soul violently snapped. He didn't see a defeated, pathetic security guard anymore. He saw a desperate father making the ultimate, unimaginable sacrifice out of pure love. He suddenly vividly heard the agonizing, terrifying sound of little Lily violently coughing in the freezing, toxic mud 6 months ago. He physically felt the sickening, crushing, unbearable weight of his own disgusting complicity suffocating his lungs. He remembered looking at his own peacefully sleeping daughter this very morning. He realized with horrifying clarity that he was building her privileged future on a foundation of innocent blood and corporate poison. The massive 6-figure salary, the lucrative stock options, the luxury imported cars, they suddenly meant absolutely nothing to him. They were just shiny, expensive chains binding him to a literal breathing monster. David's breathing became heavy, ragged, and dangerously fast. He felt physically sick to his stomach, a visceral reaction to the pure, unfiltered evil radiating from Richard and Eris. Without saying a single word, without asking for permission, David turned around and grabbed the heavy brass handle of the office door. "Where do you think you are going, David?" Richard barked, his sharp, predatory eyes narrowing with sudden, dangerous suspicion. "We have a major press conference in 20 minutes to officially announce the guilty plea to the public." David paused, his tense back facing the arrogant, untouchable billionaire. His hands were no longer shaking with fear. His paralyzing cowardice had been entirely, permanently replaced by a cold, righteous, and incredibly dangerous anger. "I need to make an urgent phone call to secure the PR narrative with the local media outlets," David lied. His voice was surprisingly steady, cold, and completely devoid of its usual subservient emotion. "I will be right back, sir." He stepped out into the quiet, heavily carpeted executive hallway and let the heavy oak door click shut securely behind him. He didn't walk anywhere near the public relations department. He walked straight into the private, soundproof, highly secure executive elevator. He aggressively pulled out his encrypted corporate cell phone. It was the very same device he had used to ignore his screaming conscience on that stormy night. This time, his thumb did not hesitate for a single second. He completely bypassed his list of corporate contacts and manually dialed a highly secure, unlisted private number. The phone rang twice before a sharp, authoritative, no-nonsense voice answered on the other end. Law offices of Sterling and Hayes, Federal Environmental Defense Division, the voice stated clearly. David took a deep, shaky breath, finally stepping completely out of the suffocating, shameful darkness of his own cowardice. My name is David Miller. I am the acting chief operating officer of the Vance Chemical Corporation. I have undeniable, physical, heavily documented proof of a massive federal cover-up. I have evidence of illegal toxic dumping, corporate extortion, and the malicious framing of an innocent man. I need your absolute best trial lawyers in my office in exactly 1 hour. The war was no longer just about basic survival. It was about to become an absolute, biblical, unprecedented slaughter of the corporate elite. 3 weeks later, the grand, imposing federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta was completely swarmed by the national media. The highly anticipated sentencing hearing for the Vance chemical disaster was about to begin. Inside the massive oak-paneled courtroom, the air was thick with the suffocating weight of absolute, unchecked power. On one side of the aisle sat Richard Vance and Dr. Eris Thorne. They were surrounded by a literal army of the most expensive, ruthless corporate defense attorneys money could buy. They wore custom Italian suits, whispering and chuckling softly to one another, treating the federal courtroom like an exclusive country club. On the other side of the aisle sat Marcus. He was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting, faded suit provided by his overworked, completely outmatched public defender. He looked incredibly small, broken, and completely defeated. He kept his head bowed, his eyes glued to the scuffed wooden floor, waiting for the judge to officially accept his forced, fabricated guilty plea. The Honorable Judge Hawthorne, an older, stern man who had attended the same Ivy League university as Richard's grandfather, banged his heavy wooden gavel. The courtroom instantly fell dead silent. Before I formally accept this incredibly lenient plea agreement, Judge Hawthorne stated, looking down his nose at Marcus, does the victim, Mr. Richard Vance, wish to make a final statement to the court regarding the devastating impact of this crime? Richard slowly stood up, buttoning his pristine suit jacket with practiced theatrical elegance. He walked to the center of the courtroom, exuding the calm, authoritative aura of a benevolent king addressing a peasant. Your Honor, Richard began, his voice perfectly modulated to sound deeply sorrowful. I did not build a multi-billion-dollar empire by being naive. I know that there are people in this world who are born into poverty, who lack the intellectual capacity to succeed through honest, hard work. I tried to help this man. I gave this uneducated, unskilled laborer a chance to put food on his table and pull his family out of the filthy, drug-infested slums. And how did he repay my charity? He looked directly at the jury box, making intense, manipulative eye contact with each juror, with primitive, violent greed. He tried to steal from the very hand that fed him, and in his sheer, staggering ignorance, he nearly destroyed an entire county's water supply. People like him do not understand responsibility, Your Honor. They only understand taking what does not belong to them. Marcus gripped the edge of his wooden table, his knuckles turning white, silently crying tears of pure, agonizing humiliation. He was being verbally crucified on live television, and he couldn't say a single word in his own defense because Lily was still trapped in the hospital. Therefore, Richard concluded, his voice rising in righteous, fake anger, I ask the court to accept his plea, lock him in a federal penitentiary for the maximum allowed time, and send a clear, undeniable message. The elite creators of this country will no longer be victimized by the criminal bottom feeders of society. Richard turned around and walked confidently back to his seat, sharing a highly arrogant, victorious smirk with Dr. Thorne. The judge nodded solemnly, completely buying into the racist, classist narrative. Very well. Mr. Marcus, please stand. Marcus slowly pushed his chair back. His legs were trembling so violently he could barely support his own weight. I am prepared to formally accept your signed confession and sentence you to 25 years in a maximum security federal prison, without the possibility of parole. The judge picked up his heavy wooden gavel, raising it high into the air. The final devastating blow was about to strike. The corrupt billionaire's trap was exactly 1 second away from snapping completely shut forever. But before the heavy gavel could hit the sounding block, the massive solid mahogany doors at the back of the courtroom violently swung open. The loud echoing crash startled the entire room, causing everyone, including the judge, to snap their heads toward the entrance. Standing in the doorway, completely dwarfed by the massive architecture of the courthouse, was a 10-year-old girl. It was Lily. She looked incredibly pale, fragile, and was breathing heavily through a portable transparent oxygen tube connected to a small tank on her back. But her dark, intelligent eyes were burning with an absolute, terrifying, unstoppable fire. She was clutching her battered, hand-drawn map in one hand. In her other arm, she held a heavy cardboard box filled with carefully labeled glass jam jars containing deadly purple sludge. And she was not alone. Flanking the tiny, sick black girl was a formidable wall of 5 extremely sharp, aggressive-looking men and women in tailored suits. It was the elite legal strike team from Sterling and Hayes, the most feared environmental defense law firm in the entire country. And walking directly behind them, his face completely hardened into a mask of pure, righteous fury, was David Miller. Marcus let out a strangled, desperate gasp, his knees buckling at the sight of his daughter out of her hospital bed. Richard Vance instantly froze, his arrogant smirk melting off his face as if he had just seen a ghost. Your Honor, wait. The lead attorney for Sterling and Hayes, a tall, imposing woman named Sarah Jenkins, practically roared as she marched aggressively down the center aisle. We are officially filing an emergency motion to completely throw out this fraudulent, illegally coerced plea agreement. The judge slammed his gavel in anger. Counselor, this is highly irregular. Who are you and what is the meaning of this outrageous interruption? Sarah Jenkins stopped right in front of the judge's bench, placing herself squarely between Marcus and his billionaire abusers. We represent the defendant, Marcus. And we are here to present irrefutable, physical and digital evidence of massive corporate fraud, illegal toxic dumping, and criminal extortion by the Vance Chemical Corporation. The entire courtroom erupted into absolute, chaotic murmurs. The media reporters scrambled frantically for their cameras and notepads, sensing the explosive shift in the atmosphere. Richard leaped out of his expensive leather chair, his face flushed purple with sudden, terrifying panic. This is an absolute outrage. This is a desperate, pathetic stunt by a guilty man. Judge, throw these lunatics out of your courtroom immediately. But Sarah Jenkins didn't even look at the screaming billionaire. She gently turned to the fragile little girl standing beside her. Lily, honey, show them what you found. The entire courtroom held its collective breath as the 10-year-old girl bravely stepped forward. Lily's tiny, trembling hands reached into the dirty, damp cardboard box. She carefully pulled out her battered, water-stained notebook and laid it flat on the highly polished mahogany evidence table. Right next to it, she placed the heavy glass strawberry jam jars filled with the deadly bubbling purple sludge. Dr. Eris Thorne leaned forward, adjusting his expensive spectacles, and suddenly burst into a loud, incredibly condescending fit of laughter. He pointed a mocking finger at the little girl's hand-drawn map. Is this some kind of sick, pathetic joke? Dr. Thorne sneered, looking directly at the judge. Your Honor, are we really going to halt a federal sentencing hearing to look at the messy crayon drawings of a sick little brat? Richard Vance smirked, shaking his head in absolute disbelief at the audacity of the lower class. This is a court of law, not a kindergarten show and tell. Get this garbage out of my sight and throw that man in a cell. But Sarah Jenkins, the lead defense attorney, completely ignored the arrogant billionaires. She smoothly picked up Lily's battered notebook and held it high for the entire jury to see. What you call crayon drawings, Dr. Thorne, is actually a highly detailed, localized topographical map. It meticulously tracks the exact flow of toxic contamination through the residential water supply over a 6-month period. The defense lawyers scoffed loudly, rolling their eyes at the dramatic presentation. A child's doodle is not admissible evidence, counselor. The lead corporate attorney objected sharply. It proves absolutely nothing except that this criminal's daughter has an active imagination. That is exactly where you are wrong. A new, surprisingly steady voice echoed through the massive courtroom. Every single head snapped toward the back of the room. David Miller, the chief operating officer of Vance Chemical, stepped out from behind the wall of lawyers. He walked slowly, deliberately, straight down the center aisle toward the witness stand. Richard Vance's arrogant smirk instantly vanished, completely replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. David, what the hell do you think you are doing? Richard hissed, his voice dropping to a dangerous, threatening whisper. Get back here right now, you spineless coward. For the very first time in his entire career, David looked his billionaire boss directly in the eyes and did not flinch. I am done running, Richard. I am done destroying innocent families to pay for my swimming pool. David reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of highly classified corporate documents. He slammed them forcefully onto the evidence table, right next to Lily's notebook. I am voluntarily submitting these official, top-secret underground architectural blueprints of the Vance Chemical plant. They clearly detail an illegal, unregulated sublevel drainage network that bypasses all environmental filtration systems. The courtroom erupted into a chaotic frenzy of shocked gasps and furiously flashing camera lenses. The judge violently banged his gavel, demanding order as the corporate defense team scrambled frantically to object. Sarah Jenkins swiftly grabbed the transparent blueprint overlay and placed it directly on top of Lily's hand-drawn map. The entire courtroom went dead silent as the two completely different documents were projected onto the massive digital screen on the wall. It was an absolute, undeniable perfect match. The childish, messy red crayon lines drawn by a 10-year-old girl tracking the dead fish perfectly traced the exact layout of the billionaire's multi-million-dollar illegal waste pipes. She didn't just find a leak, Your Honor, David stated loudly, pointing at the screen. She mapped the exact route of a deliberate daily toxic purge. Richard Vance's face turned a sickly, pale shade of gray, his hands trembling as his carefully constructed empire began to violently crumble. He is lying, Richard screamed, completely losing his composed, aristocratic demeanor. He is a disgruntled employee trying to frame me for his own massive incompetence. David simply smiled, a sad, heavy smile of a man who had finally found his lost soul. I knew you would say that, Richard. That is why I brought this. David pulled a small, silver digital audio recorder from his pocket and plugged it directly into the courtroom's main audio system. I recorded our emergency boardroom meeting on the night of the catastrophic storm. He pressed the play button. The crystal-clear, undeniably arrogant voice of Richard Vance blasted through the courtroom speakers, echoing off the high ceilings. Change his patrol schedule. Put him right next to the main overflow valve in Sector 4 at exactly 4 in the morning. Make sure the security cameras catch him standing there right when the system purges. The recording captured David's weak protest about Marcus's little girl, followed by Richard's most damning, monstrous statement. I do not care if she goes to an orphanage or a dog pound, you will do exactly as you are told, or I will personally make sure you share a cell with him. The sheer, unfiltered evil of the audio recording left the entire jury completely paralyzed with horror. Several jurors physically covered their mouths in absolute shock. Before Richard could even attempt to formulate another pathetic lie, Sarah Jenkins signaled to the back of the room. Officer Thomas, the local patrol cop, walked heavily down the aisle, his face set in grim determination. He handed a sealed USB drive directly to the court clerk. Your Honor, this is unedited, raw body cam footage from 6 months ago, Officer Thomas stated firmly. It places this brave little girl at the exact site of the illegal dumping, holding the very same jars of evidence we see here today. It proves without a shadow of a doubt that the contamination was happening long before Marcus was supposedly caught sabotaging the plant. I hid this footage because I was a coward, afraid of Mr. Vance's political power. But I will not let an innocent, hard-working black father go to prison for a crime committed by a billionaire monster in a custom suit. The video played on the massive screen showing Lily terrified, picking up the toxic sludge, proving the exact timeline of the corporate lie. The final devastating nail was brutally hammered into the coffin. Marcus sat frozen at the defense table, his eyes wide, completely overwhelmed by the explosive revelation. He looked at David, the man who had ordered him to his near death, now sacrificing his own freedom to save him. He looked at Lily, his brave, brilliant little angel, who had walked through literal toxic hell to protect her father. Dr. Eris Thorne, realizing his life was entirely over, slowly sank back into his chair, covering his face with his trembling hands. Richard Vance stood absolutely frozen in the center of the courtroom. He looked wildly around the room, making desperate eye contact with his expensive lawyers, demanding them to fix this. But his lawyers were already packing up their briefcases, aggressively distancing themselves from a sinking ship. The ultimate, inescapable trap had indeed snapped shut, but the billionaire was the one bleeding inside it. The silence in the massive courtroom was absolute, heavy, and completely suffocating for the men who had once ruled the city with absolute impunity. For a long, agonizing, suspended moment in time, Richard Vance could only stare blankly at the massive digital projection screen. His own recorded voice, echoing with pure, unfiltered malice and terrifying corporate arrogance, had just violently stripped away his expensive, untouchable armor in front of the entire world. Judge Hawthorne's face had completely transformed from a mask of stern, aristocratic authority to a portrait of absolute, visceral disgust. Bailiffs, the judge's voice finally boomed, echoing like rolling thunder across the heavy mahogany room. Take Mr. Richard Vance and Dr. Eris Thorne into federal custody immediately, and contact the FBI to initiate a full-scale tactical raid on the Vance Chemical headquarters before they can shred another single piece of paper. The courtroom instantly exploded into an absolute, deafening chaos of shouting reporters and wildly flashing camera lenses. 2 heavily armed federal marshals immediately stepped forward, their faces completely devoid of any respect or sympathy for the fallen elite. "Get your filthy hands off me!" Richard screamed, his voice cracking with pure, hysterical, deeply pathetic panic. He violently shoved the nearest marshal away, completely losing the polished, untouchable billionaire persona he had meticulously perfected over decades. "I am Richard Vance. I own half of this damn state. You cannot do this to me. I demand to call the governor right now. I demand to be taken to my private jet." But his immense, blood-soaked wealth meant absolutely nothing in this room anymore. The federal marshal didn't hesitate for a single microsecond. He aggressively grabbed Richard's custom-tailored $10,000 lapels, spun the arrogant billionaire around with brutal, unforgiving force, and slammed him face-first onto the hard, polished wooden defense table. The sharp, incredibly satisfying metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs locking tightly around Richard's soft, manicured wrists echoed loudly over the chaos. It was captured perfectly by a dozen flashing press cameras, cementing his utter humiliation for the front page of every major newspaper in the world. Dr. Eris Thorne didn't even try to fight back or defend his twisted genius. The arrogant, condescending head scientist who had brutally laughed at Marcus's lack of formal education simply collapsed onto his knees on the floor. He began weeping uncontrollably, loudly begging the furious judge for a lenient plea deal. His expensive designer spectacles fell off his face, shattering into tiny pieces under the heavy boots of the arresting officers. Across the aisle, David Miller stood quietly, offering his wrists voluntarily to a third federal marshal. He knew he was going to prison for at least a few years for being a silent accessory to the massive cover-up. He knew his lucrative career was completely, permanently, irrevocably over. But as the cold steel locked securely around his wrists, David looked across the chaotic room and locked eyes with Marcus. For the very first time in 6 agonizing months, David didn't have to look away in deep, suffocating corporate shame. He offered Marcus a small, tired, but incredibly peaceful and genuine smile. He had lost all his money, but his soul was finally clean. Marcus couldn't even process the billionaire's hysterical screaming, or the frantic, blinding flashing of the press camera lights. He aggressively pushed past the heavy wooden barricade, his legs shaking violently, and dropped to his knees right in front of Lily. Tears of absolute, overwhelming pure joy streamed down his scarred, heavily weathered face. He wrapped his strong, trembling arms around his brave little girl, pulling her into a desperate, crushing hug, carefully avoiding her portable oxygen tank. "You did it, baby girl," Marcus sobbed, burying his face deeply into her tiny shoulder. "You saved me. You saved us all from the monsters." Lily hugged him back fiercely, her dark eyes shining with pure, innocent, unstoppable triumph. "I told you I wouldn't let the bad men win, Daddy," she whispered, her voice weak but incredibly, undeniably steady. The aftermath of the trial was swift, brutal, and historically unprecedented in its total destruction of a corporate monopoly. The Vance Chemical Corporation was entirely, ruthlessly dismantled by the federal government within a single month. Every single penny of Richard Vance's multi-billion-dollar offshore fortune was violently seized and liquidated to fund the massive environmental cleanup of the slums and to pay for astronomical victim compensation funds. Marcus received a massive multi-million-dollar settlement from the seized corporate assets. The very first thing he did was fly Lily on a private medical transport to the absolute best pulmonary specialist in the entire country, completely paying off her extensive medical bills in cold, hard cash. As for Richard Vance, the arrogant, untouchable king who truly believed the law was only written to protect his profit margins and punish the poor, he was formally sentenced to 85 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary, without the slightest possibility of parole. His new permanent reality was a cold, damp, 8x10 concrete cell. Instead of smoking imported Cuban cigars and sipping vintage French champagne, his days were now spent scrubbing filthy prison toilets on his hands and knees while wearing a cheap, scratchy, humiliating orange jumpsuit. He had become exactly what he actively hated the most. A completely powerless, nameless, irrelevant number trapped at the absolute miserable bottom of the system. Karma had finally, mercilessly, and beautifully collected its massive overdue debt. But before you click away from this incredible story of ultimate justice, I want you to stop and look closely in the mirror. I want you to really deeply think about David Miller. He was a coward who silently watched an innocent, hard-working black father get framed for a horrific life-destroying crime just to protect his own massive six-figure salary, his luxury imported cars, and his daughter's elite private school tuition. It took him 6 agonizing, guilt-ridden months to finally find the courage to throw his entire wealthy, comfortable life away and accept a prison sentence just to tell the truth. So I am asking you directly, if you were standing in David's expensive Italian shoes on that rainy night, if exposing your billionaire boss meant you would instantly lose your high-paying job, face total corporate ruin, and likely go to federal prison yourself, leaving your own family completely broke and defenseless, would you have the absolute terrifying courage to stand up and sacrifice everything for a poor, uneducated security guard on day one? Or would you have closed your eyes, rolled up your heavily tinted window, and let an innocent man rot in a dark jail cell just so you could keep paying your massive, luxurious mortgage? Be brutally, entirely honest with yourself. Drop your true answer down in the comments right now, because the ugly, uncomfortable truth is, most people in this world would have easily chosen the money. Don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you in the next story.